Just days after Helene devastated parts of the southeast, tropical storm Milton has formed in the Gulf of Mexico. The storm is forecast to strengthen and bring life-threatening storm surge to the Florida coast. Here to tell us more, CNN meteorologist Elisa Raffa. This is a very worrisome sign. What can you tell us, Elisa?
Yeah, I mean, we're ahead of schedule, ahead of pace for the hurricane season. We typically don't get that M storm until the end of October, so we are about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of schedule. It's Milton, 40-mile-per-hour winds sitting in the Gulf of Mexico right now, expected to intensify. We already have flood watches in effect for the Florida Peninsula, where some 4 to 8 inches of rain is possible because we have a front that kind of is draped just north of Florida. That's going to give them rain before Milton hits and will steer Milton straight into the Florida Peninsula. I do want to point out that that means we're not looking at this turn to the north into the Carolinas, so that should at least help get the mountain communities out of this storm for this time around. We're also looking at sea surface temperatures that are incredibly warm, middle and upper 80s. So as we said, with so many of the storms so far this season, this will act as fuel for rapid intensification. As we go into Monday, we're looking at a hurricane already, and it could grow in strength pretty rapidly. Category 2 hurricane, maybe even teetering on Category 3 as it makes landfall somewhere on that Florida peninsula. It takes its time to get out into the open waters, but it takes its entire trek over these very warm ocean waters. Again, that's fuel and that's food. Then it heads towards the Florida peninsula, maybe sometime late Tuesday into Wednesday. But again, you could see the outer bands already lashing part of the peninsula here. And look at how far this range stretches, right? We're looking at it from top to bottom, from Jacksonville down to Miami. We could be looking at some rain totals of 4 to 8 inches, some isolated totals up to 10 inches. That could definitely cause some flooding. Also worried about storm surge. Where that eye goes will really depend on who gets the worst storm surge. That's something that we'll have to watch very closely. And again, it's coming on what's been such an active season already. Look at how many landfalls we've had just this season alone along the Gulf Coast, from Texas through Louisiana and to Florida. So it's been very busy and only getting busier. Jim?
My goodness. All right. Well, we're going to have to keep our eyes on that storm. That is a very scary forecast there for the Florida coast. Elisa, thank you so much.
And CNN meteorologist Elisa Raffa. So where is Milton right now?
It is still sitting in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's the problem. It's sitting over very warm ocean waters, and that's why it's been able to rapidly intensify over the last 24 hours. A Category 1 hurricane with 80-mile-per-hour winds sitting 800 miles away from Tampa Bay. The track continues to keep it over the Gulf of Mexico in those very warm ocean waters, which will let it intensify again to a major Category 3 hurricane. Then it takes its eyes to the west coast of Florida, somewhere. Landfall could be even somewhere from Cedar Key down towards Naples. We still need to kind of get that bullseye a little bit closer, and it's going to really determine that storm surge forecast, where that eye goes. But regardless, you're looking at impacts when it comes to rain, when it comes to wind, for the entire peninsula of Florida. Now, like I mentioned, we're talking about sea surface temperatures in the middle and upper 80s, incredibly warm, and that's what's allowing Milton to continue to intensify, as we've talked about with so many of our hurricanes so far this season. Now, the oceans are so warm in part because our heat from our emissions gets trapped into the oceans, which is what allows this rapid intensification, because it's food and fuel for these hurricanes. We've increased the winds here with Milton more than 35 miles per hour in 24 hours. This happens with 79% of our major hurricanes, but it's happening even more in recent years as our oceans are warmer. And again, this is that climate factor that we've been watching so closely. Again, when it comes to the forecast, we're looking at it continuing to trek across the Gulf of Mexico. Impacts start late Tuesday into Wednesday. Landfall looks like it will be sometime on Wednesday, but look at those winds. And again, it matters exactly where that eye is, if the storm surge comes up into Tampa Bay or recedes out of Tampa Bay, something that we'll need to watch incredibly closely. Again, regardless of, what category or what type of winds are, you don't need the winds to create the rain. We're talking about several inches of rain, 5 to 8 inches of rain across the peninsula. Some totals 10 to 12 inches of rain, which will cause flash and urban flooding. Again, across the entire peninsula, you don't need to be on the coast to get the heavy rain. Omar?
And especially if some of this ground is already pretty saturated, it could just make the impact of that rain even more significant. Elisa Raffa, thank you so much.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining me. I'm Omar Jimenez in for Frederica Whitfield. We begin this hour with breaking news. Milton has strengthened to a Category 1 hurricane that's taking aim at Florida. Now, the state is bracing for yet another storm threat just 10 days after Helene made landfall. And Governor Ron DeSantis is warning people in the hurricane's path to take this storm seriously.
So please keep an eye on this storm. There's a bit, the greater cone covers almost the entire west coast of Florida at this point. And even if you're not in the cone, as it gets closer, certainly if you're on the dirty side of the storm, there's going to be surge that goes outside the cone that's going to be significant. So just prepare for that and understand that's something that is likely to happen.
And just moments ago, Florida officials warned that more than 500,000 people could face evacuation orders as soon as tomorrow in just one county alone. Let's get right to CNN meteorologist Elisa Raffa, who is tracking Milton for us. So what are you seeing as far as its path and what it's projected to bring here?
I mean, we're worried about it rapidly intensifying again. And as it heads towards the west coast of Florida, that will bring storm surge up and down the coast, damaging winds and heavy rain. It is right now a Category 1 hurricane. It already rapidly intensified from yesterday. We were dealing with a depression, yesterday morning. It's got 80-mile-per-hour winds now, still sitting 800 miles west and southwest of Tampa. But it will continue its trek in very warm waters here over the Gulf of Mexico, which will allow it to intensify again to that major Category 3 hurricane. You heard the governor talking about the cone. Yes, it does include much of the west coast of Florida. We really need to focus, on the coming days on where exactly that eye goes, because that will be really the determining factor for the worst of the storm surge. But regardless, the entire peninsula will see the impacts of the wind and the rain. Again, ocean temperatures, middle and upper 80s. That's why we're finding it feeding itself and fueling itself time and time again, and intensifying. And these oceans are just continuing to get warmer. So we see these hurricanes getting extremely stronger, faster in recent decades, even surpassing the definition of rapid intensification. So it continues its trek across the Gulf going into Monday and Tuesday. We're looking at impacts possibly late Tuesday into Wednesday. Wednesday would be when that eye gets onshore and you get the landfall. I mean, look at these winds would be incredibly destructive if it's a Category 3 hurricane. And again, where that eye goes will determine where the worst of the storm surge is. If it's north of Tampa Bay, then you're going to feed all that storm surge into Tampa Bay. If it's to the south, then that's a better scenario for them. But either way, again, we're looking at very destructive waves along the coast. Now, it doesn't matter what the winds are, what category it is, it will squeeze out a ton of rain. We're looking at 5 to 8 inches of rain, again, across the peninsula, from Daytona Beach down to Miami. Some totals up to 10 to 12 inches are possible. So that gives you the urban and the flash flooding in communities even far inland for places like Orlando that are not as close to the coast. When you look at Tampa, I mean, the forecast there is 5 to 10 inches. They've got a front there now that's dumping rain, and then Milton comes. That is over 3 months worth of rain from Milton. The October average is just over 2 inches for Tampa Bay. Again, when you're talking about 5 to 10 inches in just a matter of days, on top of, they already had flooding and storm surge from Helene last week. Again, there's just this compounding factors here, adding insult to injury, already with saturated grounds and with some debris still from Helene. Flood watch is in effect again for the peninsula as we get heavier rain from a front, and then of course Milton coming through with all of that rain. And it's been such an active season. Look at all the landfalls that we've had. This is this year alone along the Gulf Coast. You had Beryl in Texas, we had Francine in Louisiana, and then 2 so far in Florida. It looks like we're going to add another one. Oma?
Yeah, we will see and continue to monitor that impact. Elisa Raffa, thank you. And
we are following breaking news. The planet's strongest storm of the year is now barreling toward Florida. Hurricane Milton is the name here. It's a monster Category 5, winds exploding to a mind-boggling 175 miles per hour. And right now, Milton is churning in the Gulf of Mexico, where it is set to make landfall by midweek, and it's taking direct aim at the Tampa Bay area.
51 counties in Florida are under a state of emergency as the storm approaches. Officials are warning residents to leave with evacuation orders in place for several counties along Florida's west coast. And many of those communities are actually still reeling from Hurricane Helene, which battered the area roughly 10, 11, 12 days ago. Let's turn now to meteorologist Elisa Raffa, who's tracking the storm in the CNN Weather Center. Elisa, what can we expect over the next few days?
Well, we're watching this intensity very closely. It will eventually wane some in the intensity. We could be looking at the peak right now, but I mean, just mind-boggling 175-mile-per-hour winds in that perfectly symmetrical eye. It's got that buzzsaw donut shape, classic textbook on satellite, sitting 700 miles southwest of Tampa. The rapid intensification today has been one for the record books, intensifying among one of the fastest on record. It was a tropical storm yesterday. I went to sleep, it was a Category 1 hurricane, and now we're dealing with one of the strongest storms on record, top 10 when it comes to that wind speed. We are looking at it scraping the Yucatan Peninsula as that Category 5 hurricane. It heads towards Florida. Notice again the intensity wanes a little bit. There's some dry air, there's some wind energy, things that will kind of chip away at the intensity some as it heads towards Florida. But we're still looking at a major hurricane making landfall, a Category 3 or 4. You have hurricane watches in effect, all in the pink for that Gulf Coast area, where we're looking at devastating, damaging winds, 110 miles per hour or greater from Tampa down to Sarasota and Fort Myers. Notice the entire peninsula getting it on tropical storm force and hurricane force winds. Now, the Tampa area, we're watching that storm surge forecast very closely. Right now, the forecast is for 8 to 12 feet. If that eye goes just to the north of Tampa Bay, that will bring in some of the biggest storm surge that the Bay has ever seen. If it goes just to the south, that will alleviate some of that storm surge for them. But again, you're still looking at storm surge up and down the west coast of Florida. When it comes to history for Tampa, they have missed major hurricane passes in the last 100 years. This could be the closest call for them since 1921. So again, really worried about that storm surge. It could be unprecedented. Boris, Brianna.
All right, Elisa Raffa, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Live from New York, I'm Bianca Goladriga.
And I'm Zain Asher. You are watching One World. Officials in Florida have a message for those in the Tampa area. Simply get out now.
And here's why. Hurricane Milton is barreling toward Florida and should make landfall late Wednesday. No one should take this storm lightly. It's the strongest storm anywhere on Earth this year.
And by the way, the timing just really couldn't be worse at this point in time. That's because this storm is coming on the heels of Hurricane Helene, which devastated Florida. Hard to believe that was less than 2 weeks ago. So it's in for it again. Tampa's mayor put her warning in plain terms.
Helene was a wake-up call. This is literally catastrophic. And I can say without any dramatization whatsoever, if you choose to stay in one of those evacuation areas, you're going to die.
Wow, and many are heeding her advice. Evacuation routes out of Milton's path are now clogged, and some gas stations are running out of fuel. Now, for those who have to stay, like emergency workers, shelters are popping up like this at Tropicana Field in Tampa. President Biden gave an update just moments ago.
We're driving up preparedness for Hurricane Milton, which could be one of the worst storms in 100 years that hit Florida, and continued efforts on Hurricane Helene. I've directed this team to do everything it can to save lives and our communities, help our communities before, during, and after these extreme weather events, and that's being done.
All right, let's talk a little bit more about Milton's position and its track as well. We've got Elisa Raffa, our meteorologist, joining us live now from Atlanta. So, Elisa, I think that one of the things that is scariest about this storm, I mean, yes, of course, it's been downgraded, but it really is how quickly it intensified, right, from a storm to this life-threatening hurricane. It happened so quickly. Walk us through that.
Yeah, it has intensified so fast yesterday, and it has really maintained that major hurricane status, a Category 4 right now. And even if you see that category waver and come down a little bit, the wind field is expanding and it's getting fatter. So that means that those impacts will spread much farther away from the center. So that's not really great either. Category 4 hurricane, 150-mile-per-hour winds. Again, nothing to sneeze at. I mean, it's down from the 180 that we had yesterday, but again, 150-mile-per-hour winds in the center, still sitting about 500 miles south and west of Tampa. That eye is opening up again. We continue to keep it at this major hurricane status. The winds could even come back up a little bit more too, teetering on that Category 5 strength, but right now we're keeping it at a 4 on the track. It starts to get some wind energy in its way, some dry air. That's why some of the intensity teeters, but again, the storm gets fatter. We have hurricane warnings in effect from coast to coast, from the west coast all the way to the Atlantic coast, and it looks like we'll keep a Category 2 hurricane over Orlando as this thing moves inland. So again, keeping a lot of its core together with those damaging winds and of course the storm surge. We're looking at winds up to 110 miles per hour or greater from the Tampa area down to Sarasota. Again, hurricane force to the other coast up to 110 miles per hour. That will cause widespread power outages. And like I mentioned, we're looking at a fatter storm. Look at how the tropical storm force winds engulf the entire peninsula and the hurricane force winds stretch from coast to coast. Again, a problem when it comes to the damaging winds, the downed trees, and the power problems. Because we are really tracking the center of the storms going somewhere near or around the Tampa Bay area, we're worried about unprecedented storm surge. That will take that ocean and push it 10 to 15 feet from Tampa Bay down to Sarasota. Water that tall is simply unsurvivable, which is why you're hearing such harsh warnings from the officials. Even down to Naples, you're looking at storm surge up to 10 feet. Again, the entire coast with this ocean sloshing. When it comes to the rain accumulation, again, rain totals could even be up to a foot. So you get the flooding, not just from the ocean, but from the sky. That's why we have a high risk for excessive rain. You don't see this high risk issued all that often. It's only issued 4% of the time. But as a result, we wind up seeing 80% of our flood damages and 40% of our fatalities. So again, flooding from the ocean, flooding from the sky, the damaging winds, really just looking at unprecedented storm here. The rain, again, could be about 3 months worth of rain in Tampa just from Milton. Ladies.
Elisa Raffa, live for us there. As you mentioned, those sorts of storm surges, those sorts of figures, simply unsurvivable.
It's going to be a very busy few days for you, Elisa. Thank you. Now let's... Hello, I'm Brianna Keeler in Washington, and my colleague and co-host Boris Sanchez is live in Florida following the very latest on Hurricane Milton, which is where we begin this hour. We are watching as this powerful Category 4 storm is barreling through the Gulf of Mexico with Florida directly in its sights. Right now, mass evacuations are underway across the state, and we're seeing this: long lines, traffic jams, and also many gas stations that are running out of fuel. The mayor of Tampa says tankers are on their way to refill gas stations in the area. And here's a look at Milton from space. This storm, it is just huge, as you can see here, and the impacts could be catastrophic with potentially life-threatening storm surge and damaging winds. Here's how Tampa's mayor put it bluntly.
I can say without any dramatization whatsoever, if you choose to stay in one of those evacuation areas, you're going to die. This is something that I have never seen in my life. And I can tell you that anyone who was born and raised in the Tampa Bay area has never seen anything like this before. People need to get out.
It's a stark warning, Boris. You're there in Treasure Island, which of course is in the Tampa Bay area. What are folks preparing for there?
Brianna, the absolute worst. It's hard to imagine seeing the state of this community in Treasure Island, a barrier island on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and imagining that anyone could survive what they are about to witness from Hurricane Milton. What you see here around me is the result of Hurricane Helene. This is debris from a Category 4 storm that made landfall hundreds of miles from here. And this debris, we're talking about mattresses, water heaters, scrap metal, glass, is just out for blocks and blocks and blocks. One of the first things that you notice when you come into Treasure Island is the smell, because the trash is everywhere. And when you're looking at a potential 15-foot storm surge on top of about a foot of water in rainfall, plus 125-mile-an-hour winds, this, as one neighbor told me, has the potential to become a countless number of missiles. And it's not just this pile here or further down this block. I want you to look at a scene that we've seen multiple times across Pinellas County. There is trash everywhere. And this enormous pile, nearly 20 feet high, is roughly a few hundred yards from the beach. The beach is actually just behind those buildings over there, and on the other side, there's a bay. So you can imagine the water is going to come into this community if the forecast stands as it is, and essentially make an enormous mess of things. I spoke to one neighbor named Matt who was here for Hurricane Helene. He said that he had to get out from his first floor apartment. He got into chest-high water. He made it to the second floor and survived. This time, he says, he's not taking any chances. Here's more of what he shared with me.
We don't know where it's going to hit at. Might hit here, might hit south, might hit north. And it looks like it's going to be devastating, particularly for buildings like this, because these are not hurricane-proof buildings. It's still out there. It hasn't been picked up. These are going to turn into missiles. They're either going to blow this way, blow that way. We don't know what's going to happen to these things. Sorry. So, yeah, it's not good. People that are around here, they need to get out of here and go someplace else. It's silly to stick around here. It's not worth it.
It is not worth it, as Matt told me. I did speak, though, Brianna, to a bus driver who's stationed outside of City Hall here on Treasure Island. She's been designated to help evacuate folks that want to get out. She says that people here have until 4 p.m. to register to evacuate, but so far today, only about 3 hours from that deadline, her bus is completely empty. Nobody has come at this point to evacuate yet. I want to get the latest on the forecast now and see exactly where Milton stands. Let's go live to Elisa Raffa, who's in the Weather Center for us. Elisa, where is the hurricane now? And in terms of strength, what are we seeing? I know there was some speculation that it might be reinvigorated to a Category 5. I guess the latest word is that it's going to stay at a strong Category 4.
Yes, right now it is teetering on that Category 5 strength. It's got 150 mile per hour winds, 156 miles per hour makes it a Category 5. So again, we're kind of splitting hairs kind of teetering along that border, but that eye is wakening up. It looks clear and symmetrical, so it's still keeping its intensity and its strength still at that Category 4 storm 500 miles south and west of Tampa Bay. We still have it waning a little bit in that intensity, still though being a major hurricane as it makes landfall. And the problem with the kind of wobbling that it's doing in the intensity is what that will do is make the storm wider. It's going to double in size, becoming fatter, so it will have a much greater reach for those damaging winds. That's why we now have hurricane warnings in effect from coast to coast, from the East Coast all the way to the Atlantic coast. We could see a Category 2 hurricane swiping through Orlando. That's how far wide reaching this thing could have. And I was incredibly troubled to see that huge mountain of debris behind you, because we're looking at 110 mile per hour winds from Tampa down to Sarasota. That all of those things behind you will absolutely be projectiles, hurricane force winds going towards the East Coast. Here's what I'm talking about. The storm again getting wider, tropical storm force winds taking over much of the peninsula, the hurricane force winds from coast to coast. That means widespread power outages. And this is the unsurvivable part. This is why you're hearing the officials use such grave wording, because 10 to 15 feet of storm surge, you have to escape that. You have that from Tampa down to Sarasota. Storm surge even still up to 10 feet, even as far south as Fort Myers. The entire coast will have that ocean sloshing inland. Plus, you have the heavy rain coming down from the sky, up to a foot possible, so multiple hazards. Boris?
Yeah, almost an unthinkable number of hazards. And as you noted, Elisa, very, very widespread. I was talking earlier about the debris that we saw from Hurricane Helene. Again, that made landfall hundreds of miles from here. It's not hard to imagine that further south and further north from where this hurricane Milton is expected to make landfall, people will be feeling the effects.
A closer look at Hurricane Milton's timing and track. I want to go to my colleague Elisa Raffa, who's following all this, of course, from the CNN Weather Center. So we just heard not too long ago the time to evacuate is now over. What else are we looking at in terms of how this storm has intensified?
Yeah, I mean, you can't evacuate now because we have the outer bands coming in. It's not safe to. People need to get into their safe place and their shelter. It is keeping its Category 4 intensity. We still have winds at 130 miles per hour in the center of the storm as it sits 120 miles south and west of Tampa. You could see the wind gusts in St. Petersburg have already made it up to 55 miles per hour. Winds are sustained at 37 miles per hour. 50 mile per hour gusts stretch to Naples and almost Miami too, 45 mile per hour gusts. These outer bands have been nasty. This outer band this morning has dropped more than 80 tornado warnings. It's common for us to see tornadoes with a hurricane. You have a spinning tropical system with a lot of moisture. Once it hits the land with all that friction, you spin up the tornadoes. But we've had a lot of these white boxes. This is signifying that it's not just a tornado warning, but they're warning for a considerable damage because the tornado is so big, large, and dangerous. So we've had some really nasty, almost picturesque tornadoes that have been on the ground in parts of South Florida, Alligator Alley. Just incredible to see the amount of tornado warnings we've had so far, and that threat continues all day today. The tornado watch goes until 9 o'clock this evening at least. The storm has also doubled in size. Yesterday, the field of tropical storm force winds was about 100 miles. Right now it is 250 miles. So that's why we're seeing such wide impacts, because the storm is just fat. It's wide. You've got winds of 110 plus miles per hour possible once that eye comes on land. From Tampa down to Fort Myers, the hurricane force winds stretch across the peninsula. We're looking at hurricane force conditions, well inland and even to the other side of the coast, which will cause widespread power outages. We're also very concerned about the storm surge. No matter what the category is, it's going to drag the ocean with it. It's had the ocean underneath it for days, so it will still pack a storm surge that might be more than you would expect with a Category 3 or 4 storm. 9 to 13 feet from Sarasota down to Venice. This would break records that were set just 2 weeks ago in Helene. Tampa Bay as well, 8 to 12 feet. That would be unprecedented for them. You've got the storm surge still up to 8 feet for places like Naples and Marco Island. This would be devastating, and notice again, it's the entire west coast of Florida, not just one point of landfall. Where you get that eye to make landfall is where you will have the most significant surge. That is really going to be a down to the wire to see where those ocean waters will pick up the most, but something to watch closely. We also will exacerbate a lot of these impacts because of this front nearby. That's what's steering Milton into Florida, but it's also increasing the rain, increasing the wind, making the tornadoes dirtier, all things that we've been watching all day. You can see that eye gets closer going into the overnight tonight. Around midnight or so, we've been watching that timely closely, but in the overnight hours when it's dark and it works its way across the peninsula going into tomorrow morning with all of that rain. Again, the front dragging in more moisture. We're going to find rain totals 6 to 12 inches up to a foot possible in a lot of locations. So you get flooding not just from the ocean, you get flooding from the sky. You get that intense heavy rain, and that's why we have this rare high risk for excessive flooding in effect for the heavy rain from Tampa through Orlando to the other coast. It's only issued 4% of the time, but is often responsible for 40% of our fatalities and 80% of our damages. Erica?
Wow, really puts it in perspective there. Appreciate it as always. Thank you.
We want to get you an update on what Hurricane Milton, now a post-tropical storm, is doing. Clearly, this was an unprecedented storm. It started out as a tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico, rapidly intensified to a Category 5, then hit the Gulf Coast of Florida as a Category 3 and continued moving on. I want to go straight to the Weather Center now with CNN's Elisa Raffa, because, Elisa, there are still parts of the East Coast that are feeling this, right?
Yes, and the East Coast after it made landfall on the West Coast last night. That's how far-reaching these impacts have been. We still have some wind gusts and some onshore flow. Charleston right now with wind gusts at 32 miles per hour. St. Simon's Island, as parts of southern Georgia, still with gusts up to 30 miles per hour as well. Jacksonville also with these wind gusts at 30 miles per hour, and again that onshore flow. So we're still looking at some storm surge possible, 3 to 5 feet from Daytona Beach up into southern Georgia, 1 to 3 feet from Savannah to Charleston. That could cause some inland flooding. Plus, we also have rip currents on all of these beaches as well. So really advising people not to go anywhere near the water. So still feeling these impacts. We're also still looking at more than 3 million people in the dark because the wind field from Milton was 250 miles wide when it made landfall. So that takes those winds and really knocks down a lot of trees and power lines still with a lot of the peninsula without power. I mean, some of these wind gusts, 107 miles per hour in Venice, Florida. Sarasota, 102 miles per hour at the peak. Even St. Petersburg, wind gusts 100 miles per hour when it made landfall. The tornadoes have also been a really incredible problem today, picking up all of the damage from that. Tornadoes in a landfalling hurricane are common, but they're weak and they're brief and they don't look like this. This is what the hurricane director called supercharged. We just don't see tornadoes like this in landfalling hurricanes. In fact, there was a record of 126 tornado warnings issued across the state yesterday. That sets a record for the most warnings issued for the state of Florida, and it breaks the record from Hurricanes Irma that made landfall in 2017 with 69 warnings, and even the record from Helene 2 weeks ago for just how active the tornado part of this has been. 126 warnings again in a day. The rain has also been a problem. It continues to be a problem with the residual flooding. This footprint of rain totals more than a foot. A lot of our reporters have been around the Tampa area, and it is because of the heavy rain that there was that flooding, and you cannot evacuate from that. Boris?
120 plus tornado warnings in a single day. Just gives you an idea of the kind of power that Hurricane Milton represented and the kind of devastation as well. Elisa Raffa from the Weather Center, thank you so much.
We still have some storm surge on the east coast of Florida, but this storm was just so far reaching. It impacted the west and east coast of Florida. I want to show you that the first advisory forecast track from the National Hurricane Center that was issued was only just a few miles from what actually happened. So we had very good confidence that it was going to impact the west coast of Florida. But look at what happened along the way. We had a lot of wobbles, and this stressed out a lot of meteorologists. All these little kind of jogs to the left and jogs to the right that it took to get to that path that we were expecting it to take. And you can see again, it wound up being a few miles difference, but this was incredibly important for us to monitor all these little jogs because it really wound up determining who got the worst of the storm surge, particularly in Tampa Bay because of the way their bay is shaped. When you look at the Tampa Bay area, we wound up getting that landfall just to the south of Tampa Bay. With it just to the south, that takes offshore winds into the bay, which pulls the water out, and you get the receding reverse surge that which wound up saving Tampa Bay from a lot of that worst case scenario. We also had prolific tornadoes in this one. I will say it is common to get tornadoes in a landfalling hurricane. You have a spinning system with a lot of moisture hitting friction on land, so you get tornadoes. But you don't get these. You usually get the smaller EF0s, EF1s. These were massive destructive tornadoes. In fact, the National Weather Service confirming that at least one was an EF3, and that is incredibly rare. We had more than 126 tornado warnings just in one day. That set a record across the state, records that were set not that long ago. 2017 and Irma was the last time we had, as many warnings. And again, that record was 69, and we had 126, prolific amount of tornado warnings for the spin-ups that we were getting in the outer bands. We even hit top 5 with Helene. That was just 2 weeks ago. Another thing to note about Milton was it was a little bit lopsided. As it got closer to Florida, it interacted with a front that has wind shear, change in wind speed and direction with height, which made the hurricane, you can see here, a little tilted, a little lopsided. So it wound up having more of its juice on the north side of it, which put that footprint of heavy rain on the opposite side of the storm that we usually see. We typically see the heavier rain coming in from the dirtier side of the storm to the south, but because of the way this one was kind of sheared and lopsided, you had more of that heavy rain to the north, and this footprint of heavy rain was prolific. You had a foot to a foot and a half of rain, all of this pink and purple stripe that you see here from Tampa through Orlando all the way to the East Coast, and that's what's causing some of the incredible flooding around the Tampa Bay area. St. Pete got 18 inches of rain. Again, Tampa, 10 inches of rain. That's what's causing the flooding, and you cannot evacuate from that type of flooding because it comes from the sky and can happen far inland. Richard?
I'm grateful. Thank you very much.
This morning, the National Weather Service has issued flood warnings for Hillsborough County. Let's take a look as first responders took on the Alafia River in Hillsborough County on Friday to rescue those stranded after Hurricane Milton ripped through the state. Other neighborhoods are also watching for potential flooding. This drone video shows flooded homes and streets near another river in Pasco County. So we're with CNN meteorologist Elisa Raffa. Elisa, talk to us about the dangers of river flooding, especially after a powerful hurricane like this.
Yeah, I mean, 10 to 20 inches of rain is going to take time to go somewhere through the watershed. So the river problems will continue going into even next week because the rivers are going to be slow to drain and will continue to rise. I mean, this is all river flooding, not storm surge, because we got just such torrentially heavy rain. And we got this heavy rain on the northern side of Milton's track because it got squeezed in with a front from the north. I mean, look at these 10 to 20 inch totals from Tampa stretching up towards Orlando and even towards the east coast of Florida. So the rivers continue to be moderate and major flood stage, not just on the west coast where Milton made landfall, but even the east coast too. Again, we had a lot of that heavy rain stretch across the state, and the watershed is still working to clear some of it out. We will not find some of these rivers on the west coast start to recede until Monday. So again, really slow to have those levels come down. And we're looking at these rivers on the west coast still getting up above major flood stage near records through Wednesday. So it will take multiple days of flooding for these rivers to really alleviate. The power problem is better, but still nearly 2 million people without power from the very wide wind field that we had with Milton. At one point, it was 250 miles, so that knocked out a lot of power for a lot of Floridians. The tornado reports that are coming in are just mind-boggling. 3 EF3 tornadoes in a hurricane is incredibly rare. We get hurricanes and tornadoes, but they're typically much weaker EF0s or EF1s. We had 1 EF3 that was on the ground for 21 miles. Long track tornadoes are rare, period, especially in a hurricane. We set a record the day that Milton made landfall with 126 warnings issued for tornadoes. That's how many spin-ups there were, how many rotations that we were finding on radar. It was just incredible to see the amount of tornado warnings that were issued, and they're still going through the damage and surveying to figure out, how many tornadoes actually touched down. This season has been incredibly busy. These are all the landfalls that we had this season alone. Beryl, Francine, 3 in Florida. That ties for the most landfalls in a season in the state of Florida. Victor?